but particularly the emerging generation of millennials, they're interested, in my view, looking with observation, in authenticity. They're interested in from the ground up. They're interested in grain. It's a much more organic process. So the challenge for those entities, and I think we'd be unrealistic to say those large entities don't still exist in our society, but they have to penetrate the dermis now and go down and find a way to make connections. Things like social networking help. A lot of things help, but we also have to figure it in our work, how to do that, how to touch every, maybe in Jordy's case, every heart, every mind. And so it's a much more complex process. But the big entity, when we do public space, the most successful spaces for us, they don't look like there's one thing, anything. And Playa Vista, you were asking about last night, this large 11-acre mixed-use center with lots of shared space. It's a kind of a main street from an American town. That's the metaphor. We're not imitating anything, but that's the scale of it. You could find places for yourself. If you were a young family, there'd be places for kids to play. If you were two people on a date, there'd be a place for you that was romantic. If you were older and wanted to watch stuff, not talk to anybody, you could do that. There are all these things. So it's really kind of touching every heart that we're after now.
Anybody else have anything to add about how expectations of public space have changed?
Well, I think there's been a challenge to the idea of, and this will be interesting because I know this is a little controversial, but I call it the difference between ego-driven and client-driven design. We're very client-driven because we're dealing with brand strategy. The emotion comes from what the end user wants, the experience of either people, if it's retail or commercial, coming to their space or their employees or whatever. And it's kind of like what I was trying to get at in my lecture was there's kind of a paradigm shift with who controls what. And I think still architects in a certain way, no offense, will design to a certain way based on their vision. But I think we're finally in a culture, hopefully, where we're starting to think about the people that actually use the space. And in my classes, I talk a lot in branded environments about manipulation. It's not necessarily a negative word. That was a negative example, I guess. I still would love to have gone into Janet publications. I thought it was cool. But, there's manipulation for good, which is kind of what you're talking about. Creating space that acknowledges the reality of emotions and experience. And so it becomes, if you will, user or client-driven. And I think we're getting smarter about that so that everything doesn't look postmodern and all this weird stuff we built that now we're having to deal with. Granted, we have to rip out and all that stuff. So.
Yeah, I was looking up some things that designers have said about public space and events and this, and came across a quote from the British designer, architect, and educator Cedric Price, and he said architecture, and I know he also was speaking about interior design when he said this, but he said architecture must concern itself continually with the socially beneficial distortion of the environment.
I think that's kind of design. Hello, can you hear me? No? Okay.
No, you're not up that easy.
What Cedric Price was talking about was that whole idea of malleability, and that public space needs to be able to change. And he did that quite successfully in a number of his projects. So, no, I think that's even more true now than before.
And I know something you were interested in talking about was the idea of hacking in space and maybe the feeling that there's a tendency to overprogram space and you have to let it find its own identity.
Exactly. Nothing's working. Never mind.
1, 2.
Yeah, you guys are on.
I think public space needs to match the people's desire because right now, like in China's case, although China is a communist country, it used to be all about the politics in the city squares, but now it's about we have to build something to please the people. So we have to consider what people want. They want more beauty, more flexibility, more fun, more excitement, and so the public space needs to reflect these desires.
And I just want to comment, it's interesting, if any of you are familiar with, at the Merchandise Mart, they've opened something called 1871, which is a complete tech floor for small startups and entrepreneurs and they kind of lease space by the month at desk. Well, what they did is they stylistically so branded the space as 1871 that what's happening is you go up there and these people are in their little cubicles. They don't want to use the shared space. And they're taking paper printouts and they're putting their brands up with tape on these systems because they're trying to own it. And I think to your point that maybe you didn't hear, this whole thing about we can only go so far, and then people are going to use things the way they're going to use it.
Yeah.
And are we helping progress the world to think differently? Or are we the ones that have to start listening? And where's that line? You know, how does change occur? Because sometimes we do have to push people, but at the same time, to the point that they don't like space and can't work in it, it doesn't make sense. So it's an interesting dichotomy because we're starting to acknowledge people's needs.
No. Caroline, are you?
I have no idea if anybody can hear me.
Is Caroline back online again? Can we hear her?
No, this doesn't work either.
Here.
That's okay.
Uh,
What were you going to ask?
Okay, I wanted to ask Caroline about Quadrangle's own new office, because you were saying to me that you wanted your common areas to be larger than they had been before, and you've got that one big space that functions as a dining area and lecture hall and so many other different things. You said people are using the whole office differently because of how the public space, how you now have common areas that really work for you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. In actual fact, the design of the studio changed the way we worked almost instantaneously, mostly because and this is a trend that's happening a lot in workplaces, is that real estate is expensive, so the individual footprint is having to shrink, but that space is now being given over to more common spaces, collaborative spaces, focus spaces, because there's of course the backlash against open office now going on as well.
Yes, I want to ask about, yeah.
Yeah, so it's really providing the variety of spaces which allows activities to take place. And none of us can guess how technology is going to change how we're working 10 years from now, and we'd be foolish to try and think that we're clever enough to make sure that we're designing in anticipation of that. And I think the most important thing is for us to get out of the way of what people are wanting to do more often than not, and making sure that the space in actual fact can be changed.
And I wanted to ask Tom something about, as we've just kind of got, yes. I'll try not to ask Scott and Caroline the same question for just a few minutes here. But one for Tom, we were just talking about office spaces, and you've done so many showroom spaces, and showrooms are very challenging, I guess especially in building like the merchandise market, because you've got, in some cases, a real bowling alley footprint and all kinds of strange kind of spaces to deal with. But in a showroom, you've got some spaces that are more public than others. You've got the spaces that are primarily for the clients to come in and look around. You've got the spaces where the staff and the clients are interacting. And you also have to have enough back-of-house space for the firms there. So how do you make all that work when you've got a tight space?
Well, first I have to say, actually the Mart is probably one of the easiest buildings I've ever worked in. We do showrooms all over the world, and there's some, like we were just in some stuff in Washington, D.C. that all I could think of is this would be great for Chicago rats. You know, it was just unbelievable. But to address your question, you know, when you're dealing with showroom space, you're dealing with premium square footage. I mean, people are spending double what office space is to have these places, many of which are basically only used for shows. So what the hell? And so what we try to do is build in multifunction. It's like, well, first of all, have more activities than 1 or 2 shows a year. Sales staff, sample distribution, all these other things that occur, but also to try to integrate the back of house into the front of the space. And there are techniques to do that. So you're not putting a box, so there's a sample room in the back, and you know how that is. There's a concrete floor and all the staff sitting on some 25-year-old steel case. You know, we actually try to integrate it into the space because what we're trying to do is actually just capture the value and the opportunity to create more display. And it's about how each company wants to function, what their what they're expecting out of the space, but we have learned to figure out ways to actually make that integrate. I mean, I could go into examples, but
Yeah, actually,
yeah.
I was wondering if I could ask you to talk a little bit what you did for my Romanov. You showed a few
Uh,
of their slides, and that
Oh, Maya,
is just
yeah,
an
that was
amazing,
great.
amazing space.
Well, they were such a great client. You know, when you have people who are transparent about what they're about and how they think and how they sell and how they service clients, it's like a win-win because they're so authentic. To create something like when Maya went in there, he's in a wheelchair now. He's got Parkinson's. He cannot communicate, so he has a little like keyboard, you know. And I asked him what he thought of what we had done, and he typed, "I see me." And I'm like, scar. Because to understand that company is to understand him. And in terms of how we use that space, because it was basically the dog space of the building, because there was no corridor exposure. It's a completely convoluted wall system. You can't impose a square in there. It's like, go with it. And when Joyce said to me, when they turn this corner, I want them to be able to see everything and decide where to go and what to do, that drove everything else. And so even the column enclosures are like Buckminster Fuller's what was the car?
The Dymaxion car.
Yeah, like a Dymaxion, so that you actually flow by it and they tilt on radiuses towards that point. And so everything is aligned, but even the storage room
Yes.
was basically one of the radiuses that became a wedge.
Oh.
And it works beautifully because they did need back a house. But again, it acknowledged what was going on. They take people back there because, like, isn't this cool? And that's success. I mean, you know, when you get the client excited, when people walk in there and they're excited, when they go in there and they're like, I'm not in the merchandise mart. I'm in the world of Maya Romanov. And they should be, especially for what they're paying. It's like, you get it, right? And so, I don't know, is that kind of what you're
It
looking
is.
at?
And I'd like to ask Jordy and Scott something at the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, since you're both working a lot now in Asia. I'm sure it's very different trying to create public spaces where there's not a lot of urban context to begin with. I mean, if you're building on a greenfield site, there was just nothing there but grass beforehand, and suddenly there's this huge, complicated development. Are the issues very different when you're trying to create effective public space, when you're sort of starting with a blank slate, than they would be if you're inserting something into a city that has been, a streetscape that has been there for decade after decade?
Well, in China's case, most of the time we build on the blank slate because the city has been growing so fast, and every single project is on a green land. And so in this case, what we're trying to do is that to incorporate some of the local culture and or sometimes because we work a lot with fashion brands, so we incorporate their brand identity into this urban development, at the same time considering some of the local architectural elements. But of course, we have to make sure those spaces function as a very successful mixed-use space, and it's very different than you are inserting a public space into existing context. A lot of the time, other architects mostly just because there's no context, you just do whatever you want. But what we're trying to do is really to create an image and tell the story about the client and the city.
Yeah, you said that successful public space tells a story.
Yes.
Scott,
Yeah,
what would you say about your experiences?
Yes, all that. You know, I think it's mostly for us when we're in Asia, not always. It's a sort of a de novo opportunity to blank slate. In our case, and I think this, I'm cautious speaking about China with Jordy because he gets it on a lot of levels, and we're probably invited from California for different reasons that she's invited. Sometimes we're invited into Asia because there's some notion, correct or wrong, that we're the progenitors of lifestyle, global lifestyle. And if you want a 4-star, 5-star hotel, well, we're the ones. And if you want to golf or drink wine in Napa, well, we're those people, right? And we just sort of create all this. And if you throw TV and social networking and movies on top of it, well, we're the ones, right? So we're coming. And I think Jordy has another whole set of connections and probably insights that maybe be different, in some cases superior to mine, in all honesty. But it sets up for us, maybe not for her, a very counterintuitive opportunity, because particularly in California, where, as I mentioned, we don't have weather, okay? The idea to connect up with inside and outside, to do a public space which naturally reaches out, and there's fluidity between outside and inside. So there's a natural biological connection to nature and form and all of that with what you're doing collectively. That's sort of instinctive to us, but if you're in Jakarta and it happens to be 110 degrees outside and 98% humidity, guess what? You're not going to be out sitting in the pasture, you know, you're going to be in the shopping mall. And, you know, the grandparents are going to be doing their stroll, and the family's going to maybe go for a movie and have some tea and coffee and whatever, and the kids are going to be racing, roaring through the thing, and it's going to be secure, you're going to be comfortable, and by the way, it's a culture which is aspirational, and it's